大家下午好，欢迎来到浦东美术馆。浦东美术馆的大型展览呢，曾梵志过往于此刻，自去年9月开幕以来，受到了各界的高度关注。今天呢，我们非常荣幸地邀请到了知名的艺术史学者理查德·西弗博士，与我们一同分享他眼中的曾梵志艺术30年。本次讲座呢，大约时间为50分钟，稍后会有15至20分钟的对谈交流环节。本次活动由浦东美术馆与梵志艺术与教育基金会联合主办。今天呢，浦东美术馆的董事长李敏坤女士与梵志艺术与教育基金会的总监钟嘉贤女士也来到了我们的现场，有请2位女士。有请敏坤总。
尊敬的西弗博士，尊敬的各位来宾、各位观众，大家下午好。非常欢迎大家今天来到这里，来聆听西弗博士的讲座。关于我们这一次浦东美术馆举办的曾梵志老师的大展。那么这个展览呢，其实在去年9月份开幕以来，真的是受到了社会各界的广泛关注和非常好的评价。我在很多的社交媒体上都看到有很多的观众在发表一些评论和意见，大家都是被曾梵志老师的这样的一个非常高的艺术造诣所折服，然后大家也非常的感受到曾老师在他的艺术生涯当中，不断的在前进，不断的在创新，不断的在发展，这个也是让大家极为敬佩的地方。尤其是我们的这个馆，大家来看展的时候会发现说，当曾老师那个展览开幕的时候，当时我们有一个600年之巨匠的展览，它基本上是在回顾600年的这个西方油画史的一个发展过程，有很多的艺术流派。那么现在我们的馆里边呢，有一个卡拉瓦乔的油画展，那么也是代表了那个巴洛克时期的一些油画的特点。但是大家会正因为这样的一种布局，就会有非常深刻的感触，是说我们的油画它是怎么样的在发展的，然后在这个发展当中，它已经是诞生了那么多的一个艺术形式，那么多种的一个技法，然而曾老师仍然是在这样的一个基础上，他又有了新的创新和又有了一个新的一个提升。那我们的油画始终是在前进当中，而曾老师为此是做出了巨大的贡献。就我们可以看到很强烈的曾老师的风格，但是呢，它的不同的阶段又有着不同的很大的差异。不同的差异之下，你又觉得说，他每一个阶段都有很鲜明的曾老师的个人风格，即使是他不同的阶段的画作是不一样的，但是你看到他的时候，仍然一眼会认出来说这就是曾老师的作品，这也是很神奇的一个地方。所以我们今天呢，也是特意的请我们的西弗博士来对曾老师的这个展览为大家做深度的诠释，因为西弗博士是对曾老师的作品极为了解，他们在一起打交道了好几十年，所以对这一路过来，我们曾老师所有的这些作品，我相信西弗博士都会给大家很好的解读，也非常的感谢博士远道而来，感谢各位今天来参加讲座，希望大家在这里度过一个愉快的下午，谢谢。
有请嘉贤。
So good afternoon, everyone. Also, good afternoon, the artists, director of Museum of Art Pudong, and also all our distinguished guests. My name is Gladys Chong, director of the Fanzhi Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our seminar today, co-organized by the Museum of Art Pudong and also the Fanzhi Foundation. Here, I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to our speaker, our scholar, Dr. Richard Shiff, who has traveled just 2 days ago far away from the United States to here in Shanghai to be with us today. The Fanzhi Foundation was established by the artist Zeng Fanzhi in 2011. It is a non-profit organization that supports the development of modern and contemporary arts by organizing public seminars, exhibition and research programs. With the label Art Talks programs, we have been organizing free public seminars since 2017. We carefully select and curate inspiring topics from art history, we invite local and overseas scholars to come over to Asia to exchange and introduce their innovative theories and also methodologies, hoping to encourage more exchange among young scholars in Asia. So today, the program, the seminar is part of the whole program. It's also held in conjunction with the exhibition Zeng Fanzhi, Old and New. It represents to the public as of today one of the largest exhibitions of the artists in China, with more than 60 works from different periods and different styles. So talking about the art of Zeng Fanzhi, over 3 decades of exploration, he has accumulated so many different styles. With such a rich body of work, he's very prolific, protein, very diverse, with multiple views. And very importantly, he keeps on challenging, reinventing himself through different painting mediums and different genres. So, such a diverse artist, how can we start? How can we approach him? Where can we start? There must be some key leading concepts guiding the artist in different experiences, in different stages. Concepts, they are very diverse, but concepts, they are also very correlated, echo with each other to form a synthesis. There must be underlying principle or threads running through all different stages to define Zeng Fanzhi as one, as a unity. So talking all about this concept is exactly what we want to organize this seminar to help the audience to better understand Zeng Fanzhi. And among all many scholars from all around the world who has been contributing in this regard, I think Dr. Richard Shiff is one of the best to lead us with his insider and also scholarly insight. He has been a very close friend to the artists in the past. He following his work, visiting his studio, publishing, writing articles for the artists in the past 10 years. Starting from 2 very important publications in 2010, and then get to the legendary retrospective show of the artist in Paris in 2013, in which he contributed with writings, down to the latest collaboration we have in Museum in Los Angeles in 2019 in a seminar, and then follow with a catalog. Besides, he is also a pioneer to introduce many key concepts for the Western audience to understand Zeng Fanzhi. He presents all these ideas in a very sustained, precise way to English-speaking audience. He has extensive knowledge in modern and post-war contemporary arts. He often holds lectures at the universities for this area for years. Being so knowledgeable and resourceful, he often not just talk about Zeng Fanzhi art, but also map the discussion against a wider context of painting history. So hereby, he bring over the topic. This is a statement taken from a writing he has for the artist in a catalog, to be published later following the show. In this seminar, he tried to propose 3 concepts in a hypothesis how for us to understand Zeng Fanzhi art with 3 works: Stillness, Movement, and Pulse. So 3 works correspond to 3 different realms of feeling, sensory experience, and also 3 states of perception one can be found in Zeng Fanzhi art. And I think very interesting is that if you look into 3 concepts, they are very precise. You can use this, grab this to approach Zeng Fanzhi. And interesting enough, if we follow Dr. Shiff's argument and then we study thoroughly all the case studies that he provides, you will find these 3 concepts are not exclusive to one another. Instead, they coexist in one work, one stage, and they are related, so it explains altogether why Zeng Fanzhi moved from one stage to another stage. So I think they are very practical and very powerful hypotheses, all the audience can grab and use. And there's so many other examples and elegant interpretation he will provide you in the following lecture. And I believe everyone will enjoy and be benefit from it. So now let's please welcome with me together Dr. Richard Shiff to the stage. Richard, please.
Thank you so much, Gladys. A wonderful introduction. And thank you, Zeng Fanzhi, for making this art. In a certain way, this lecture focuses on translation. I'm not referring to the fact that my talk is in English and is being translated or interpreted simultaneously. Between any two languages, there is always a loss of precision, and this can be troublesome. But such a loss happens all the time, even between speakers of the same language, since we can't control how our own words are understood by others. Translation is a necessary feature of communication because any statement that a person makes becomes a message destined for another person who interprets it in their own way. The art of Zeng Fanzhi has become international. It speaks across the barriers of local languages. This art translates between languages that are truly universal, the language of representation and the language of abstraction. We may not be conscious of our use of these two languages because they are as natural to us as our ability to use our eyes and our hands. We all know how to convert simple marks into images. A mark, such as a stroke of paint, is in itself an abstraction. It becomes an element of representation when it contributes to creating an image or a picture of something seen. It can also represent a symbol, like a number or a character in a system for inscribing words. Every mark that we make projects an element of representation, and at the same time, every mark remains an element of abstraction, preserving its own sensory qualities. In a work of art, abstraction and representation coalesce within a zone of sensory enlightenment. Today, I want to demonstrate that Zeng Fanzhi has been extraordinarily effective in expanding the traditional art of representation. He has accomplished this by investigating the ways that representation and abstraction interact within innovative pictorial forms. As I talk, it may seem that I refer to representation and abstraction as distinct phenomena, but you will also sense how these two forms of sensory experience converge and unite. Every work in the exhibition is remarkable in its way, but I'll refer only to a limited number, tracing some of the paths of perceptual awareness that Zeng has opened for us. At the left on the screen is Zeng's painting of Boots from 2009. It's obviously a work of representation, very much a picture with an identifiable subject. It captures the blackness of the leather, its exterior contours, the reflectivity of its surface, and the contrasting qualities of the interior of this shaped material form. I'll return to this work in a few minutes. But first, at the right, is a painting of 2015 that Zeng calls an abstract landscape. Its pictorial elements of color and line create the vague sense of a landscape, but not a specific one. In the painting shown on the left, we might be able to identify the style of boot depicted, but when we inspect the painting on the right, we have only a general sense of landscape rather than an image that represents the character of a particular place. Zeng's abstract landscape is very large. You've no doubt noticed that in the exhibition. It's 4 meters in height and 7 meters in width. It's large enough to suggest the feeling of being surrounded or even dominated by the immediate environment that the strokes of color create. Unless you step very far back from this painting, you have to scan it to see all of it, as if your eye were a movie camera, moving along with the traces of the flow of the strokes of paint. The size of the work makes it difficult, if not impossible, to grasp it in its totality all at once. I first saw this painting in New York in a very large gallery space. I realized as I was scanning it with my eyes that I was repeating the movements of the artist, who had to keep changing his physical position and viewpoint in order to cover such a large surface with paint. Right now, looking at the screen, we're viewing a projected image of the work. As a projection, we don't perceive its true physicality, all the textural elements, in the way that we do when we stand before it in the museum gallery, conscious of our own physical size in relation to the work. We have a series of photographs that were taken in the artist's studio as the painting was in progress. They show Zeng using a brushstroke that, given the size of the canvas, inscribes an appropriately broad gesture. He used an elevated platform to reach the upper zones of his composition. He covered the entire length relatively quickly while shifting his position from right to left and left to right. Although the individual marks are large, they're limited by the artist's own physical size and the reach of his arms and brushes. The painting is composed additively, stroke by stroke. Each of the strokes, seen individually, suggests the material qualities of paint, its fluidity, its viscosity, its chromatic vitality. The strokes are not descriptive in themselves. Nevertheless, as the strokes accumulate, a vague image of a landscape emerges. This doesn't happen because the artist had a specific composition in mind from the start. Instead, the image results from the process, which is more abstract in character than it is representational. And here we see the painting as it advances further. And here, further advance. If we follow the extended linear vectors, especially in the view of the painting on the right, the view that's shown on the right, we might imagine the representation of thin stalks of vegetation. I'm thinking of this area up here. The linear traces rise from bottom to top, countering the horizontal movement of the thicker marks of bright blue, deep blue, and pale yellow. So you have a lot of movement that is more horizontal and some more vertical. As the lines rise, they seem to grow in the way that plants do. We might conclude that Zeng is representing growth itself, rather than a fixed image or an array of plants at a certain moment. As I've suggested, his large paintings often appear more cinematic to me than photographic. In other words, they are moving. They're not still. I move with them empathetically. Here again, we see the painting close to completion. To the right is a detail of the center of the painting near the top. You can see the relatively thin linear strokes, which look as if continuing to move, continuing to gesture. To me, these lines, rather than describing the dense undergrowth to be observed in nature, seem more like gestures of inspired feeling, as if the artist were responding to internal bodily rhythms, or to music, or even to the movements of dance. The rhythms that we perceive are abstract. Now we see the painting in its final stage, with the immediate foreground accented by the introduction of thicker linear elements. The detail below, illustrating an earlier stage of laying in the marks, shows how vigorous and active the individual gestures have been. So you get a sense of how much energy is going into all aspects of the production of this painting. And here again, the finished painting. Zeng gave it a very generic title, Blue. I suppose that any composition in which blue is the dominant color could logically acquire this descriptive designation. But the title provides very little representational information. Many things become blue when painted. By convention, at least in the West, both water and sky are blue. Atmospheric effects, such as fog, are often depicted as blue. Blue is the color of distance. Let's focus on some of the thick linear elements as well as the thin ones. You can imagine the thin tracings as the result of a quick gesture upward. The thicker lines seem more deliberate, with a greater number of changes of direction as they traverse the composition. They angle in different ways. These dark lines or bands are highlighted in a much lighter tone. To achieve this effect, Zeng retraced the thick line with a thin line along the edge. One line thick and dark, the other line thin and light. Two lines, two colors, one movement. The thick lines resemble the branching of a plum tree. I don't think that such likeness indicates that Zeng must have intended to represent a plum tree within his abstract landscape. Instead, I think that his familiarity with the growth of trees, and vines too, has allowed him to internalize the feeling of these natural forms. The feeling itself is an abstraction, not a representation. It belongs first to the artist, and only secondly to the objects he observes. One way to appreciate this source of abstraction within a painting, even within a representational painting, is to empathize with the sensations that belong to the creation of the work. We all do this naturally without thinking about it. It's like having a visceral and emotional response to the flight of a bird. The trace of the bird's movement is an abstraction. It amounts to what Zeng calls a feeling. The same kind of internalization may be responsible for the form of Zeng's sculpture of 2016, created 1 year later, a work that represents a plum branch, but not a specific one taken from nature. This extended linear form is an imaginative construction of the angular joints and curvilinear segments of a living tree. Here, however, it lives in the hands and vision of the artist. We're now comparing the sculpture to a detail of the painting. In 2010, Zeng told an interviewer, "When you are trying something new, you are feeling the paints and even communicating with them." So as he made the branch-like forms, Zeng was feeling the resistance of the paint against the support of the canvas. He was feeling the viscosity specific to the oil paint medium, and he was feeling the pull and stretch in his body as he constructed both blocky deposits of paint and linear extensions of it. You can feel the same kind of pull and stretch, perhaps more obviously, by looking at his sculpture. Now finally back to the picture of boots. The boots look very much like a case of direct representation by comparison with the abstract landscape. But let's look more closely at how Zeng rendered the reflective surface of the finely textured leather. He needed to translate reflectivity into the language of the painter's brush. Zeng chose to make a series of vertical paint strokes, one after another, in contrasting white against the black. Along the edge of the shoe, there are 3 curving bands of these strokes, each a kind of echo of the others, and each with its own variation, an internal rhythm of bright and dim. 1, 2, 3. The rendering of the reflection on the leather acquires a life of its own, a kind of abstraction, an abstracted feeling of the play of light in the invented environment of the picture itself. Every aspect of Zeng's picture of boots reveals its own life of abstraction. We easily see the totality as a convincing representation, but each element of it is abstract. How such abstraction translates into representation is the miracle of painting. And no one really understands where the conversion occurs, in what place, at what moment. All we know is that one sensation becomes another sensation, and the conversion can also reverse when representation returns to a condition of abstraction. Zeng's art calls our attention to this miracle of perception and recognition. Let's look now at a painting from 20 years earlier in Zeng's career. He was painting representations of the life of the ordinary people around him. A man is getting a haircut. At this time, Zeng was admiring the boldness of the imagery of the German expressionists of the earlier 20th century. So let's compare the haircut picture to a self-portrait that Max Beckmann painted in 1927. The broad brushstrokes of both Zeng and Beckmann are especially free of illustrational detail. They stand out as expressive gestures of their own, marks that convey or even represent the feeling and the energy of the artist. I see a great similarity between Beckmann's depiction of a shadowed area on a shirt front and Zeng's bold manner of depicting the draping of the barber's cloth over the body of his client. So, just a strong brush action here, and really even stronger here. Each stroke is a forceful accent determined more by the feel of the paint on the brush than by the specific character of the fabric being depicted. Working in this manner, Zeng asserted his independence from the dominant social realism in Chinese art at that time. I've always been especially impressed by the painting of 2003 called I, or sometimes called We, a triple portrait. Here, Zeng used vertical spiraling strokes. Each spiral moves up from the bottom edge of the canvas through strategically placed areas of contrasting color. The spiraling strokes spread the other colors, blending contrasting hues into a continuous skin. The spirals are abstract traces of the repeating movements of Zeng's arm and hand, which skillfully varies the tonality in the process of making the line. So it's as if, as the continuous marking proceeds, it wondrously generates the details of an image. Each line is like a digital unit of a projection system. Zeng has varied the pressure on the spirals so that each of the three images, left to right, loses some of its potential resolution. As a result, each becomes more of an abstraction and less of a focused representation. But there is no absolute division between the two perceptions. When I was asked to write a short statement for the catalog of the exhibition, I realized that I could make a distinction between three states of existence, three realms of feeling that are evoked by Zeng's art. These three perceptual states are, first, the feeling of stillness. Second, the feeling of movement. And third, the feeling of pulse or pulsation. In discussing the large abstract landscape titled Blue, I've already addressed the feeling of movement or gesture in Zeng's lines and broad strokes of paint. Now I need to address the factor of stillness and the factor of pulsation. My first acquaintance with Zeng's work was with the very well-known series of masked figures. These images are extremely precise, especially along the edges of the distinct forms. Down to the finest of strokes, the placement of every paint mark in the mask series relates to the placement of those surrounding it. Because of this compositional precision, every detail of the representation constitutes a case of abstract art in miniature. For example, in the work of 2004, now on the screen, strokes of red and black situated just below the figure's exposed hand generated a shape that echoes the hand, although as its counterpoint, red and black opposed to red and white. So that countering shape is right here surrounding this. Looking more closely, as I came to know the works of the Mask series, I became increasingly aware that I couldn't imagine changing or shifting any of the artist's marks. All was so tightly constructed that these images seemed set in stone. This condition is what I regard as stillness. So looking closer again, note that the red lines of paint that articulate the veins and the boniness of the hand they seem to be cupped or cradled by the black lines just below to the left and just above to the left. So it's here and here. The straight black fold in the fabric near the bottom of this detail corresponds with the straight edge of the sleeve above set almost at the same angle. It's the spacing and the contrast of the marks that I can't imagine changing. Not because it would damage the representation, but because it would damage the perfection of the abstraction. So I'm referring to the way that this relates to this. The figure in portrait, like others in the mask series, is, despite its stillness, entirely alive. Despite the nominally stiff posture, the outward stare, the hands set into the pocket, the legs set rigidly parallel to each other, we can sense an animated tension in the body. The dimensionality of the standing figure, its existence as a volume, is undeniably convincing as pictorial illusion. Yet the crisp edges of the figure's coat and the planarity of the toy horse to the left, as well as the unmodulated foreground floor and background wall, all contribute to a vision of pictorial flatness. The flatness is an abstraction. The volumetric illusion is a representation. The toy horse of childhood, a complement to the standing adult figure, appears to have been constructed of planar pieces of wood fastened together. It has wheels that seem as if they will never roll. The toy's stillness amounts to unrelieved flatness, like the flatness of the unarticulated environment of gray wall and ochre floor. Each element has the potential to modulate or to move, but none appears to move. These sources of unrealized potential, locked into stillness, convey a sense of endurance, which is movement or passage in time. Because time registers emotionally, stillness is not without feeling. Perhaps the passage of time is best indicated by Zeng's shadows. The one cast by the figure projects forward, while the one cast by the toy horse projects backward. The difference suggests rotation, as if we were walking around what we're seeing. Viewing those objects from different angles. But if you imagine an interior source of light located between the figure and the toy, those shadows might align in proper perspective. Zeng's realism is sometimes so precise that it seems caught in its own immobilizing perfection. The same might be said of the boots that we've already viewed. Zeng's result is a stillness that seems strangely energized. I don't want to leave the mask series without referring to how astutely Zeng observed the evolution in Chinese society during his own early decades. We've already seen the painting on the left, a study in blue and gray. The much brighter mask painting on the right is from 1995. When interviewed later in 2014, here's what Zeng said. In the 80s, there were only a few colors being worn in China, blue, green, and gray. But in the late 80s, early 90s, clothing had more colors. People had more facial expressions than before. That's not to say that they had no facial expression at all. But in the earlier years, their emotions were more hidden. Maybe what everyone saw was normal. That's how Zeng concludes his thought about the past, normal. His remark about what becomes normal strikes me as a brilliant observation. Everyone was trying to conform to the implicit rules of behavior in the newly expanded environment of the urban centers. So everyone masked their interior feelings, showing on the outside only the limited range of emotions that everyone else accepted as the norm, or at least normal enough. This is why, despite the exaggerated expressions of the masked figures in Zeng's paintings of the late 1990s and early 2000s, each figure looks like the others. Each is trying to conform to the appearance that the other is projecting outwardly. On the screen now is one of the sparkling paintings, Water number 5, completed less than a year ago. I may be making too rigid of a set of distinctions, but Zeng's sparkling paintings are both still, like the portraits of the Mask series, and moving, like Blue and other abstract landscapes. These paintings pulse. To Western eyes, they evoke the art of Claude Monet and Georges Seurat. I think of Monet because of the concentration on the reflective surface of water viewed close up and without a horizon line. I think of Seurat because the application of paint, whether by brush or by knife, sets a number of contrasting colors into action, as if they were pixels on an electronic screen, cohering as a representational image. I'm now showing details of works by the 3 artists. In all 3, the optical qualities are the result of the texturing of paint, the quality of touch. In the 19th century, Monet and Seurat achieved their optical effects by exploring innovative ways of making structured abstract marks, expanding the range of texture and reflectivity in paint. The material surface of Zeng's paintings of water project a screen-like effect, but the surfaces themselves are hardly flat. They consist of ridges and depressions of paint that correspond to the action of the hand pressing down and lifting up. The surface rises and falls like water affected by currents of air. Optically, the same surface scintillates, pulses, and sparkles like light reflected in multiple directions. At times, Zeng added color to an existing textured segment of the surface, just as Seurat would set one pointillist dot on top of another. Or Monet would have a line of color skim over the surface of a contrasting color. Such a line breaks into reflecting, pulsing fragments. If we get close enough to the details of both Boots and Water number 5, we can sense the pulsing light that results from the broken surface of paint strokes. An object or substance that pulses remains in its place, yet is continually in motion. In the case of Zeng's painting of water, I have a fantasy that water itself, an unstable fluid, can be agitated by rays of illumination that strike it. The light corresponds to the range of chromatic color within the painted surface, numerous saturated hues that animate the represented water, granting to light a paradoxical materiality. Zeng's sparkling paintings establish an elemental presence of pulsing light, at once substantial and insubstantial. The pulse, on and off, in and out, links tactile sensations to optical ones. Water 5 becomes an enveloping, all-consuming sensory experience, both representational and abstract. A few years ago, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam invited Zeng to create studies of Van Gogh's art. He showed 3 of these works at the museum, all based on Van Gogh's self-portraits. Each was painted in Zeng's own distinctive manner, but each also remained recognizable as a work of Van Gogh. I want to bring this lecture to a close by showing one of these paintings, along with Van Gogh's own, and quoting what Zeng said about his experience. I try to re-experience Van Gogh's self-image when I paint his face on the canvas. As I work, I feel like I am gradually befriending a stranger and getting to know this stranger better and better. In the next state, I add my marks over the painting, using my lines to cover and even submerge his face. Eventually, I make his image emerge, once again, from the sea of lines. Zeng's reworking of a Van Gogh self-portrait becomes Zeng's self-portrait. The appearance of the marks represents Zeng at work, and in this sense, it is his portrait. Yet, he was painting as if being guided by the hand of Van Gogh. Perhaps the result is Van Gogh's representation, but Zeng Fanzhi's abstraction. When Zeng refers to adding his own marks, we see the result in the abstract linear gestures that resemble the marks in Zeng's abstract landscapes. But then Zeng says that he reverses the process and returns some of the look of Van Gogh's original image. So it is both Van Gogh and Zeng in the finished work, which has allowed Zeng to feel like Van Gogh. And all this happens not so much because one representational portrait looks like another representational portrait, but because the abstract feeling of the marks conveys the feeling of the person. Here we might be witnessing another example of pulse or pulsation. In this case, it is not the feeling of light moving in and out or on and off, but of the living pulse of 2 human beings, 2 distinct people, separated by global distance and separated by historical time. 2 separate beings who unite in the feeling of paint marks that they share. Thank you.